Today, I'm going to discuss, rather, going to start the topic. It is on exception handling. Do you know what is exception? So far, the program that we have written in Java, first we have to make it compile and then we have to execute. The compilation command is Java C and the execution command is Java. That we have done so far. And sometime we face some errors, which is called compile time errors. But some cases are there in Java where the normal flow of the program is disrupted. If you have forgot to give any semicolon, or if you have forgot to give an opening bracket, that also shows you an error. That type of error is termed as, it's a compilation error. But some problem is in Java where an exception occurs. What is the meaning of exception? The meaning of exception is the normal flow of the program is disrupted and the program or application, it terminates abnormally, which is not recommended. Let me share a note with you. I will send this note through mail. Let me share the screen. Fine, look. Hopefully it is visible to all of you. So what is exception? An exception or exceptional event is a problem that arises during the execution of a program. So just earlier I mentioned, if I forgot to give a semicolon, forgot to give a opening bracket, closing bracket, that will also show us an error. But that error comes in the program compilation time. But some problems are there which arises at the runtime, and if that problem arises, the program or rather application will immediately stop over there. Like you have declared an array of size 5. Suppose you have declared an array of size 5. Hello. Suppose you have declared an array of size 5. When you are storing the 5 elements over there, no issue, no problem. But if you store the 6th element, try to store the 6th element in the array, a runtime error occurs and the program will stop over there if you not handle that error. So this type of errors which occurs in the normal flow of program, and it basically disrupts the program execution, normal flow of the program and program execution, and the program execution or application execution is abnormally terminates, which is not recommended. This is called exception, and this exception needs to be handled. this exception needs to be handled. An exception or exceptional event is a problem that arises during the execution of a program. During the execution of a program, when your program executes, you may face different types of problem. Like suppose you have declared an array of size 5. When you store the 5 elements in an array, it executes fine. But when you are going to store an element at index 5, index 5 means it's a 6th element. 0 to 4 is the 5 elements, 0th element, 1st element, 2nd element, 3rd element, 4th element. These are the 5 elements. But when you are going to store the array element at the array index 5, that means you are going to store the element at 6th element. At index 5 means it's 6th element. So means you are going to store element that is not in the array size, not considered in the array size. So what will happen? This will not give you the compile time error. When you compile it, you will not get any error, because there is no grammatical mistake, rather any syntactical mistake is there. That's why you will not getting any errors. But when you try to execute the program, what happens? Your program gets disrupted and your program terminates abnormally. This termination is not recommended. Definitely we don't want that our program will terminate abnormally. So this type of errors which occurs at the time of execution, that type of error can be termed as exception, which basically disrupts the execution of the normal flow of program, and it may terminate your program also. Abnormal termination of your program, and that is not recommended. Fine. So that's why we must have to handle these exceptions. If you not handle it, our program will stop at that point where exception occurs. Means the point, the line number, just if you consider our previous example, you have declared an array of size 5, integer array of size 5. Say at one single line you are writing ARR 5 equal to 100. So that means what? That means you are assigning, rather you are storing an integer value at index, you are trying to store an integer value at index 5. That is basically the 6th element of the array. And it is not permissible because you declared the array size as 5. So when you are going to store the 6th element in an array, an exception will occur and your programs will terminate at that point. And then this termination is abnormal termination, because many more lines or many more instructions after that line which not gets executed, because your program abnormally terminates. So that is the reason. That's why we must have to, what to do? We must have to handle exceptions, because this abnormal termination is not recommended. Is this clear to all of you? Can I proceed, or have you have any doubt?
Yes, sir, clear.
Is it clear? Do you have any doubt? Fine. So I already mentioned an example. There are many reasons for which an exception may occur. Just like this points, a user has entered invalid data. Suppose you have a division operation. Suppose you have a division operation, x by y. Fine. So you are taking input the value of x and y from user. If you give the value, rather if you input the value of y as 0, then what is the consequence? Something by 0 is infinite. So your program cannot proceed. An exception will occur. An exception will occur and your program cannot proceed. Your program abnormally stops at that point. So this is also can be considered as an exception. So why exception occurs? Users has entered an invalid data for the variable y. As because user entered the value of y as 0, that's why the exception occurs in this case. So there could have many reasons for which exception occurs. Just like this, a user has entered invalid data, a file that needs to be opened but cannot be found. Suppose there is a file programming. In the programming, user has given a file name, or rather path of a file name, which is not really exist. So if this type of event occurs, then that can be considered to be an exception and your program will immediately stops over there. If there is a network related problem and network connection has been lost in the middle of communication, or JVM has run out of memory, exception occurs. So there are many reasons for that exception may occur. So some of these exceptions are caused by user error. Some of the exception, user error means at those who are using that program. So some of these exceptions are caused by the user error, some of them by programmer error, and others are by the physical resources that have failed in some manner, just like in the previous cases. First case is from the user end. Second case, it may be the from programmer end, because programmer have provided the file path, but the file is not exist over there, or rather given a wrong path name, wrong file name even. Fine. This type of error happens, rather this type of exception occurs due to the reason of programmer end, and others by the physical resources, just like this communication fails. In the case of network related program, communication fails. That can be considered as a exception. So based on these three categories of exception, we must have to understood how exception will be handled in Java. Two types of exceptions are in Java. One is checked exception and other one is unchecked exception. This one is checked exception, first one, and the second one is unchecked exception. Try to differentiate these two. Both are exceptions. That means both are disrupted the normal execution of the program, and when this occurs, your program terminates abnormally, because both are exceptions, and according to exception definitions, this we already know. When exception occurs, your program immediately stops over there if it is not handled. So to avoid this unintentional termination of your program, or rather of my program, what we have to do, you have to handle it. And that's why we have to learn how to handle this exception. Fine. So what is checked exception? It is an exception that occurs at the compilation time, and these are called compile time exception. These are called compile time exception. This exception cannot simply be ignored at the time of compilation, and the programmer should take care of handle these exceptions. From the user input, when we are taking input from user in our program, we have used scanner class, right? Import java.util.star, and we have used scanner class. There is a read line method. Fine, we have used this. There is another approach, that is, we can use buffered reader class object. We can use the object of a buffer reader class. I will show you later on. That is another options for taking input from user. So far we have used only one option, that is scanner class, but we have another option that using buffer reader class. There is a class called buffered reader. So using buffered reader class, we can take input from the user. When we will use this buffered reader class to take input from user, we have to write public static void main throws IO exception. Public static void main throws IO exception. Why it is written? Because I have used a class, or rather object of a class, or some methods of that class, which may throw an exception, and we have to explicitly mention that exception handling line. We have to explicitly mention that exception handling part in our program. Otherwise, you will get a compilation error. In this case, an example is discussed over here. Just look this. It is a file handling program. We are creating a file object, or rather trying to read a content of a file. So we are going to create a file object, and we are providing the path of the file. Fine. Under E drive, we have a file.txt, and this is coming from file reader class. Fine. So if the file specified in its constructor doesn't exist, then what will happen? It will throw file not found exception. And that's why the compiler prompts the programmer to handle the exception. Just look this. If you try to execute that program, you will get an error. You are not running your program. You are not executing your program right now. What you are doing? You have just created an object, and there is a file reader class. Inside this file reader class, you have passed the file. Try to understand. You are passing that file object. This file is nothing but an object you have created. But when you are going to compile this program, you will face a compilation error. Why? Because file methods, it is written over here, methods that read and close of file reader class throws IO exception, the file reader class, this file reader class, I am going to create an object of this file reader class. Fine. So inside this object, what I have passed, I'm providing the path of the file that is under E drive file.txt. And I have just passed that file object into the very next line when I'm going to create a file reader object, an object of class file reader. We have to pass a file object. File object I already created over here, and that object is passed over this place as a parameter of the file reader constructor. That is not very related to us. We have no idea regarding the file reader class so far. So that's why we already know what is the meaning of exception. We know that exception may occur at the runtime, means when the program executes. In this case, if I try to compile this program, I will got an error. I got an error. What is that error? It is an unreported exception. File not found exception must be caught or declared to be thrown. So what is the meaning of this? The meaning of this is that the exception occurs, may occur, not occurs yet, may occurs from this file reader class, and that's why you must have to declare that exception. You must have to declare that file not found exception, and it should be thrown and it should be handled. It should be declared, it should be thrown, it should be handled. How it can be declared, thrown and handled, that will come later with an example. But if you not mention it, just like throws IO exception, if you not mention it, this will give you a compile time error. This will give you compile time error. As because why? Because this class, rather this method main, is using read and close method of file reader class. So this file reader class may throw an IO exception. So that IO exception must be declared from main also, rather must be written from main also, just like this. Public static void main string args throws IO exception. That I will discuss in detail later on. Just try to understand what is the meaning of checked exception. Checked exception is a type of exception if you, that is already defined, and if you not handled it at the time of compilation from your program, you will get an error in this manner: must be caught or must be declared to be thrown. Must be caught or must be declared to be thrown. So this type of exception is called checked exception. And unchecked exception, an unchecked exception is an exception that occurs, that type of exception we already introduced to you, that occurs at the time of program execution. These are called runtime exception. Fine. For example, just like that, I already discussed about this. Array of size 5 in your program, you are trying to call the 6th element of the array, and you will get an exception, and the name of the exception is this much, this big: array index out of bounds exception. Try to follow. Array index out of bounds exception. So what is this? It is basically a class. I am showing you the hierarchy of this exception class so that you can understand. So before going to that part, just like this, an example. Anyways, so try to differentiate between these two type of exception. One is unchecked, another one is checked. So now I am talking about the unchecked exception. What is this thing? Look, this is an integer array that I have declared, rather initialized, not declared, 1, 2, 3, 4. And if I try to print, rather we try to access the array elements of size 5, or rather index 5, I will got a runtime error, which is called exception, and the name is java.lang array index out of bounds exception 5. Fine. So why this exception occurs? Because I am trying to access a index 5, which is not declared, or rather not initialized. So that's why an exception occurs, and because it is not handled in my program, so my program terminates at that point. Which point? In this line, system.out.println num5, because we are trying to access at the index 5, which is not basically exist in my initialization of this array part. So this type of exception is called what? An exception is unchecked exception, which occurs at the time of program execution. So some exceptions are occurs at the compilation time, some exception are occurs at the execution time. Those are occurs at the compilation time, it's called checked exception. Those are occurs at the runtime, it's called unchecked exception. Fine. Another type of exceptions that is called, rather it is not at all an exception, rather it is an error that arise beyond the control of the user of the programmers. Errors are typically ignored in your code because you can really do anything about an error. Error means that is not syntactical error. It is talking about the errors just like this. If a stack overflow occurs, you have, as a programmer, there is no option for you to do something to ignore, rather to solve that error. You have no way out as a programmer. So that's why what to do? Typically ignored in your code because you can really do anything about an error. If a stack overflow occurs, there is nothing to do for a programmer to solve it. So that's why it is not considered at all as an exception. It is an error, and there is no solution for the programmer end to solve it. Fine. So rather we are focusing in these two type of exception. One is checked, another one is unchecked. Firstly, we will concentrate on the unchecked exception. That means which occurs at the program execution time. Fine. So before going that, this is the hierarchy. You must have to know. Yes, you must have to know what means which class is coming from where. Initially it is java.lang. Fine, that is the package, java.lang. Under java.lang we have a class named object, and in my earlier lecture I mentioned that object is a class which is basically the parent of all other classes. There is a class throwable which is the child of this object class. This is the hierarchy I am talking about. So throwable is nothing but the child of this object class, and that is two subclasses you may consider. One is errors that we are talking about. We have no hand to solve it. And another part is exceptions. So basically, exception is the class. Exception is our mother class. And under this exception class, we have n number of exceptions defined, just like array index out of bound. This is a class. Earlier I told this is a class, but this is a child class of exception class. So we have different types of exception, that is runtime exception and other exception. These exceptions are belongs to the exception class. There are different types of methods is discussed over here. So next question, how we handle our exception. This is the code. That means we have to use two keywords. One is try, another one is catch. This is our try block. This try block, the code that may throw an exception, you must have to write that code inside try block. Try to understand. The code that may raise an exception, a code that may raise an exception, you must have to write that code. You must have to write that code. You must have to write that code inside try block. And the handling part, the code that you try to handle is used for the handling purpose, that must be written inside the catch block. And later on I will show you one try block may have 0 or more than one catch block. I will show some example after this discussion. So this is the syntax. Using this we can handle if exception occurs. Just like this. Look, this is my main method. I have declared an array of size 2. Fine. Int a is an array variable. I am declaring an array of size 2. When I am going to access the element 3, rather index 3 element means which is not present because I haven't declared that array. I have declared that index. So definitely an exception will occur. If an exception occurs, if you not handle it, your program will stop it at that point. As because there is a catch block, and what is written over here? Array index out of bound exception. In the general syntax, what I mentioned I have to write here exception name. Exception name means it is nothing but a class. I must have to write over there. It may be array index out of bound exception. It may be arithmetic exception. Which type of exception can be termed as arithmetic exception? Suppose divide by 0. Divide by 0 is a type of exception which is a type of a arithmetic exception. So in that case you have to write arithmetic exception E1. Similarly, in this example, the name of the exception, the type of exception occurs here, may occurs here, that is array index out of bound exception. So that's why you have to write array index out of bound exception, that is E. And what you have written? You have written index thrown. You are trying to print E. What actually E is an object. And I earlier told when I going to print the value of E, that basically transfers to string by calling toString method. And it basically returns you a string for that object. And out of this catch block closed over here, out of this catch block, what I have written, system.out.println out of the block. So what is the output of this program we can expect? And exception occurs over here. That's why it executes the catch block. As because it executes the catch block, it prints E, and this is the result of print E. Exception thrown, java.lang array index out of bounds exception 3. And then after It is coming out from this block and prints out of the block. So what is the difference between not handled case and handled case? This one is the handled one, where we handled our exception. There may be a situation that we discussed earlier, we haven't handled the exception. So what is the difference between these two? When I have handled the exception, the program will not terminate at the point where exception occurs. Here exception occurs in this line, right? But the program is not terminated over here. Try to understand. The exception occurs in this line. Why in this line? Because I'm trying to access index 3, which is not yet declared. I have declared an array of size 2 only. So as because I haven't declared, so that's why exception occurs. As because I have handled, that's why program is not yet terminated. If I not handled this one, the program will terminate in this line. So how I handle it? What I have done, I have just printed, I have to write some code over here under catch block, and I have just printed the value of E, and the value of E is, output of E is this much. java.lang.arrayIndex out of bounds exception 3. That is the meaning of E, because exception thrown, that is already a string I provided. So exception thrown this much is not in the value of E. The value of E starts from here. java.lang.arrayIndex out of bound exception 3. And after execution of this catch block, it will come out from here and prints out of the block. If you not handled it, your program will stops at that point. This rest of the lines, that just like this, out of the block, this line will never be executed. As because you haven't handled, your program, an exception is occurred in your program and you haven't handled, so that's why program stops over there, which is completely unintentional. So that's why we must have to handle the exception, and this is the way through which we can handle our exception, by writing try and catch. What is try block does? Try blocks basically throwing an exception. What is exception? It is nothing but a class. Exception is nothing but a class, and this class have n number of subclasses, just like array index out of bound exception, just like arithmetic in exception, file not found exception. These all are coming from the exception class. So exception is the root class. So what this try block basically does, try block is basically throwing an object of exception class. Fine. And what catch block does, catch block is basically catching that object, that type of object better to say, and handling that exception. That is the basic fundamentals of this try catch block. And after coming out catch block, if many more instructions are there, if many more statements are there, that must be executed in normal manners. One try block, I already mentioned earlier, one try block may have 0 catch block, that I will show you in an example, or may have n number of catch blocks, just like this, the second part. Look, there is only one try block, but one try block have more than one catch block. Definitely this exception type are not same for all three. Suppose in your program there is a case of division 0, there is a case where we are trying to access an element which is out of array index. So an exception may occur as a type of arithmetic exception. An exception may occur at the type of array index out of bound exception. So that's why against one try block, there can have more than one catch block. Fine. Up to this much, is there any confusion? If you don't have any confusion, then I will move to the some program. I hope this screen is visible to you.
Yes, sir.
So this is the first program. It's just a simple program, but what we are doing over here, it's a try inside try block. So before writing this, if I write a program just like this, just a minute. I'm showing you a simple example first. It's a simple program of just a try catch block. This is your main. What I'm doing over here, I'm trying to divide a number 39 by 0. Fine. So if an exception occur, so this try block will throw an exception object, and if you're not handled it, your program will terminate. Your program will terminate in this point. Which point? Where the exception occurs. Your program will stop at that point. If you not write it inside a try block, rather try catch block, just this, I'm just commenting this line, and at the same time if I commenting this line also, fine, catch block. So what is the output of this program? I am commenting the try part as well as the catch part. What is the output of this program? Build, execute file, process completed. Look, going to divide, this line gets executed. Very next line an exception occurs, and the name of the exception is given by java.lang.arithmetic exception division by 0. I haven't written this code inside try block. Fine, because I have commented the try block. So just written on this line and no catch block is there. So as a consequence, I am getting this. An exception occurs in this line and program stops over there, as because this is not yet handled. Fine. I hope this much is clear. Is there any doubt up to this for this program? No question. Fine.
Sir, if you are commenting the try block, then how it is printing going to divide?
Because this is the normal flow of the program. Forget about this try block and these two braces. Forget about this two. Now, what you have written? Public static void main system.out.println going to divide. This is running fine. So this is giving the output. Next line, it tries to divide the number 39 by 0. So this is nothing problem for this line. This is nothing problem for this line. This is just a simple printing statement. So why this will show you an exception? No error is there. It is syntactically correct. That's why no compilation error. There is nothing missing over here. So that's why it will print fine going to divide. After execution of this line, when your program going to execute this line, then the exception occurs. Showing you the line number, so that explain when your program executes line number 7, there is no issue with line number 7 because it's just a print statement. But after completion of the execution line number 7, when it comes to line number 8, then an exception occurs, and you don't have written this code inside a try block. So that's why no exception object has been created and it will be thrown. Understood, Pavan? Any doubt? Hello?
Yes, sir, understood.
Fine. Now I am writing this code inside try block. Why I am writing this code inside try block? Because I assume that this part of code may throws an exception. May. If you write it one variable over here, say in C, and if you take the input for this C variable, your user, if give any non-zero value, your program will run fine. Your program will run fine if user put the value of C any non-zero. If C equal to 5, your program will execute fine. Let me check. Suppose you are taking input from the user the value of C. Let me print the value of B, which is not yet printed over here. System.out.println B. Look, 39 by 5, integer by integer is giving you integer. So no exception occurs. Your program runs fine. Catch block will not be executed because the value of C is non-zero. So it can divide 39. If you put the value of C is 0, now the problem occurs. Because when it's going to divide the value 39 by 0, that is not possible. Exception occurs. Which type of exception? Arithmetic exception. Arithmetic exception occurs. That's why this try block will throw an exception object. Which type of exception object? Arithmetic exception type of exception object. That's why in the catch block, as a parameter, you have to take a reference E. It's a reference name. Which type? Arithmetic exception type. What is arithmetic exception? It is nothing but a class. It is nothing but a class and is a subclass of the exception class. Fine. So it throws an exception that will be handled in this line, and this is the exception handling code. The code that you have written inside this block, it may be 1 line, it may be 3 line, it may be 5 line. Whatever you are writing inside this catch block, inside this catch block, here only 1 line is written. Whatever the line you are writing, that is basically exception handling code. So that is handled, and as because the exception is handled, the program will not stop at this point, and this normal flow also gets printed. Look, I'm executing the program. Going to divide, first line, Second line exception occurs. When this exception occurs, it will come out from here. It throws an exception object, whether arithmetic exception object. This catch block will catch that exception object and it will print the value of E. We know what is the value of E. It is just java.lang.arithmetic exception divide by 0 exception. Fine. And then it is coming out from the catch block and it prints the whatever the lines is there. It is normal flow. So it prints the normal flow of the program. Process complete. If you not handled it, your program will stop over there. If you have handled, then it will move to the next part of your program. And how can you handle? That is the try and catch block. The part of code that may arise problem, that may throw an exception, that part of the code you must have to write inside try block. And if exception occurs, your try block will throw an object of exception class, or better to say any specific type of exception object, just like arithmetic exception object, array index out of bound exception object. And finally, after execution of the catch block, it will come out, and if any normal statement is there, then that statement also gets executed. If you not handle your exception, your program will just stop over there. I have shown that, I have explained this through this example. Do you have any? I'm moving to the next example, probably the last example discussed today that I'm going to discuss earlier. Look, this is the exception handling program, which is try block inside another try block. Try block inside another try block. Just like, look, this system.out.println, it is 390. This part is basically throwing an exception. Which type of exception? It is arithmetic exception. And that is handled inside this catch block. Try to understand. This is handled inside this catch block. So this catch block is for this try. This catch block is for this try. Fine. Second part, another part of another code snippet where we have declared an array of size 5, but we are trying to assign 4 to the 6th element. Index 5 means it's nothing but 6th element. Definitely this try block will also throw an exception. Which type of exception? Array index out of bounds exception. Array index out of bounds exception. Try to follow the name. This name are already defined. There is not this. These are the not user defined exception. These are not user defined exception. So you must have to follow the naming convention of these classes, just like this. Arithmetic exception, A capital, E capital. Similarly, in case of array index out of bound exception, A capital, I capital, O capital, this O capital, this B capital, and this A capital. You have to follow the same thing. Otherwise, your program will give you an error, because these are the classes which are already defined as an exception class. And these all are the, what I mentioned earlier, these all are the child classes of exception class. Fine, these all are the child classes of exception class. So you have to write as it is defined. So that's why I have to follow this, or rather you have to follow this when you are mentioning in your program. So this code snippet will throw an exception, which is a kind of arithmetic type of exception, rather arithmetic exception. This code snippet can throw an exception. Which type of exception it can throw? It is an array index out of exception. Look, this is the catch block defined for this try block. This is the catch block defined for this try block. Fine. And these two try blocks are written inside another try block. And this is the catch block for the outermost try block. This is the catch block. This is for the outermost try block. So what the type of exception, it is written over here. It is written over here, exception E. That means if any exception occurs within this body that is not handled over here, will be handled by this catch block. As because I have written the mother class name, rather parent class name, which is the parent class, exception class is the parent class. So that's why any kind of exception object, any kind of exception object can be handled by this catch block. As because it is taking, it is written as exception E. Exception is the parent class, and we already know as per the concept of inheritance that parent class reference may point to a child class object. Parent class reference may point to a child class object. So exception is the class which is parent class. So as because exception is defined over here, so it may point any child class object. So any kind of exception which may occur in this try block, outermost try block, can be handled by this catch block. So it is for this catch block is for the outermost one. This catch block is for this try block where array index out of bound occurs, and this catch block is for this try block where divide by 0 exception occurs, and divide by 0 is a arithmetic type of exception, rather arithmetic exception. So now try to execute this program. Showing you the output. Going to divide, very nice. Going to divide, exception occurs, fine. So it is coming to the catch block. When it is coming to the catch block, it prints system.out.println E. So that's why java.lang.arithmetic exception divide by 0 over this part over. Next coming to this part, int a5 is 4. So array index out of bound exception occurs. Look, java.lang array index out of bound exception occurs. System.out.println E, array index out of bound exception occurs. Then system.out.println other statement. System.out.println, it is other statement. Other statement gets printed. Fine. So this catch block will not be executed because no exception occurs in this try block. The exception occurs in this try block already handled by the catch block. So none found in this try block which is not yet handled. So that's why there is no execution of this catch block. Fine. Then normal flow. So I hope you understood the explanation of this program output. Look, when the exception occurs in this line, so immediately it will throw an exception object. Fine. Which type of object it will throw? Divide by 0. It's a type of arithmetic exception. Try to understand. It's a type of arithmetic exception. So it will throw to the corresponding catch block. Catch block is defined with the exception class, which is the mother class, which can point any type of exception. So that's why arithmetic exception is handled by this part, and that's why handled gets printed, and after that there is a lines normal flow that gets printed. These lines will be omitted. That's because exception occurs in that point, and at the same time when exception occurs, it throws an object. It throws an exception object, and it will be handled by the catch block. So that's why after execution of the catch block, it will not return again that point. That is the point you need to be noted. After handling this exception, your program control will never back to that point. It will flow to the next instruction. So that's why your output is normal flow. After getting printed handled, the output is normal flow. So don't leave the room.